we, that is Canada, agreed to offer forces in Afghanistan simply to please the Americans, because the government had said no to Iraq. And so they didn't want to antagonize the Americans beyond measure. And so it was a sort of token of our supplication to the Americans that yes, we are peaceful people, but we are your friends, and we will do something so that you're not terribly displeased with us. It didn't really help us, because when it came to the solution of softwood lumber, we really didn't get very much from the Americans for our offering of homage to their war in Afghanistan. So essentially, as far as I'm concerned, we have no Canadian interest in Afghanistan. And to say that we are fighting them there so that they won't come to fight us in Canada, I think the likelihood is that they are not sure to come to Canada, because we have gone there and we have killed their people. Now, you can see this from the periodic statements that are made by Canadian commanders and American commanders apologizing to the Afghan people. 21 people killed, 19 people killed, because somebody gave the information that the Taliban were hiding, and so the Americans went and bombed the place without making sure whether there were Taliban, and killed a party of 19 or 20 or 21, including old men, women, children. So there is no Canadian interest in Afghanistan, and as you can see from the debate that has been going on in Parliament, and no clear picture has emerged, and the opposition has not been convinced of the answers that have been offered by the government of Canada. So the answer is no. Now the second question is, what do we seek to accomplish in Afghanistan? That is, what is the objective? And this is, I find, the most wasteful. Essentially, we are trying to provide development for the Afghans. We are trying to enable them to run democracy. That is essentially what we are trying to do, is to transform the generations-old political culture of Afghanistan and to shape it in the image of what we have here. That is essentially, we think we can change the values by which the Afghans have lived. Yes, values do change, but they change under generally domestic stimuli, and the change takes a long period of time for people to accept it. And so the whole business about making Afghanistan a democracy, as far as I'm concerned, is sort of wishful thinking. There is no reality to it. I mean, let me ask the question. Why do we want the Afghans to accept our kind of democracy? Suppose the Afghans were to come here and impose the Taliban type of government on us because they consider it the best form of government for themselves. Would they be justified? And obviously the answer is no. And if they won't be justified in bringing their form of government to us, why should we feel that we are justified in taking our form of government to them? And so, not only that we have no right to impose our form of government, we do not have any means. Political cultures, yes, I know. I come from India, and India is a democracy. It was not historically a democracy. But we tend to forget that the British were in India for 300 years, and they were ruling directly for 90 years. And over this period of 90 years, they went from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, and it was the gradual transformation of the political culture of India, which was achieved through lowering the Indian elites towards the political system that the British offered. If you look at the people who were running India at the time of independence, and 99% of them were graduates of British Inns of Law. That is, they had imbibed the British values so deeply that they could practice them. 90 years. Does Canada or the United States plan to stay in Afghanistan for 90 years? And also, India was at a much more advanced stage of development when the British started in 1857 than Afghanistan is. So in the case of Afghanistan, an equivalent time would be maybe a couple of centuries. It's not going to be so, which means that regardless of whatever we say is the objective, we are not going to show the staying power for that purpose, which means we will leave the mess in the middle somewhere. Now, what vehicle do we have to pursue our objective? That is, are we doing it directly or are we doing it through someone? Well, what we have is a government headed by Karzai, Hamid Karzai. The government essentially is what should be called the Northern Alliance in a different form. The Northern Alliance was pushed by the Taliban to a very small area in the north. And then came the Americans, and they used the Northern Alliance to push the Taliban back. And of course, the Americans were bombarding the country from the air, and the Northern Alliance was provided with arms and ammunition and so on. Now, already the Northern Alliance had been rejected by the majority of the Afghans who had supported the Taliban. Why had they supported the Taliban in preference to the Northern Alliance? Northern Alliance had unleashed a reign of terror, rapes, looting, brigandage, and the Taliban were successful in putting a stop to this. They gave the Afghans security in return for total submission. Mind you, I'm not saying that the Taliban were the Democrats or they were more desirable, but when you have anarchy and chaos for years, security is the primary requirement before you want anything else. The Taliban had given the Afghans security. They had, of course, imposed an exceedingly harsh and austere form of Islamic law on the Afghans. And we know women couldn't come out of the house. And they even forced people to paint the windows, the glass of the window on the first floor black, so that you couldn't see inside, and those inside couldn't see what's happening outside. So women were totally excluded from the public sphere. They could not go to schools, they could have no education, and also they couldn't take any jobs. Now, it's terrible, and of course, the feminists in Canada and the United States find it absolutely horrible, except that the Taliban didn't invent this system. They simply exacerbated it. That is, it already existed in Afghanistan. That is how it was. I've been to Afghanistan several times. I've seen how the things were. I mean, hardly saw women on the street. And those you did see were clad in that burqa from head to foot. That was the norm. So the Taliban didn't invent, they simply made it, just intensified it.